The city was a circuit board beneath him, a sprawling grid of pulsating lights and flowing data that Kalen Vance could read as easily as a book. From the 100th floor of Vance Tower, his penthouse was less a home than a command center, a sterile sanctuary of glass and steel suspended between the heavens and the earth. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, distorting the metropolis into a watercolor painting of neon streaks and bleeding shadows. For most, the storm was an inconvenience. For Kalen, it was merely an atmospheric variable, another set of numbers to be factored into the global ballet of finance that he conducted with the precision of a master choreographer. His world was one of absolute control of predictable outcomes, calculated to the 10th decimal point. Emotions were liabilities, attachments were risks, and impulse was a fool's gambit. Tonight, however, a glitch was about to disrupt the perfect code of his existence. The drive home was a silent, fluid affair, the custom-built sedan gliding through the deluge with practiced indifference. Arthur, his head of security, and a man whose loyalty was as unbreachable as a vault, sat in the passenger seat, his gaze methodically scanning the surroundings. Kalen's attention was as always on the tablet in his lap, its screen glowing with the fluctuating fortunes of the Tokyo Stock Exchange. He rarely looked out the window. The world outside was a chaotic, unpredictable mess, a stark contrast to the ordered universe he had built for himself. But a sudden jarring stoplight, red and angry against the gray torrent, forced his gaze upward. It was there in the fleeting glare of the headlights that he saw her. She was a tiny silhouette against the raging storm, a child no older than 6 huddled in the recessed doorway of a closed bakery. Her clothes were soaked through clinging to a frame so small she seemed in danger of being washed away by the next gust of wind. She wasn't crying or screaming for help. She was simply there, a statue of silent misery, watching the river of traffic with wide, unblinking eyes. Something in Kalen's meticulously ordered mind fractured. It was inefficient. It was a deviation from the plan. He had 1,000 reasons to command his driver to move on, to erase the image from his mind and return to the comfortable certainty of his numbers. The child was not his problem, not his responsibility, a rounding error in the grand equation of the city's populace. "Stop the car," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. Arthur turned his expression a carefully neutral mask, but Kalen could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. The driver hesitated, the light having just turned green. "I said stop the car." "Here." Kalen's command was not a request. The sedan pulled smoothly to the curb, its engine a low hum against the drumming of the rain. For a moment, Kalen just watched the girl through the rain-streaked window. He was analyzing a variable he had never encountered before, one that defied any risk assessment protocol he had ever designed. He was Kalen Vance. He did not get involved. He did not act on impulse. And yet he was already reaching for the door handle. Arthur was out of the car before him, a large black umbrella blooming open to shield Kalen from the worst of the downpour. "We don't know the situation. It could be a trap, a setup." Kalen ignored him. He walked toward the doorway, the sound of his expensive leather shoes muted by the storm. As he approached, the girl didn't flinch or run. She simply looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights. They were old eyes, he thought, filled with a stillness that was profoundly unsettling in a child so young. He crouched down, maintaining a respectful distance. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice sounding foreign and gruff in the open air, a voice accustomed to boardrooms, not abandoned children. The girl gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He looked back at the warm, dry interior of his car, then back at the shivering child. Logic dictated he call the authorities, let social services handle it. It was the correct, efficient, and detached course of action, but the image of her small, still form being swallowed by the uncaring bureaucracy of the city felt incorrect. It was a miscalculation he was unwilling to make. "Come with me," he said, the words leaving his mouth before his brain had fully sanctioned them. "You'll be safe." Instead, after a long moment of quiet assessment, she placed her small, cold hand in his. The journey back to the tower was surreal. The girl, who he learned was named Ilara from a faded tag on her worn backpack, sat on the plush leather seat, leaving a damp patch on its pristine surface. She remained completely silent, her gaze fixed on the blur of city lights passing by the window. Arthur occasionally glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his professional composure strained by this unprecedented event. Kalen found he could not look away from her. She was an anomaly, a piece of data that didn't fit any known pattern. He had brought chaos into his sanctuary, and for the first time in a very long time, he had no idea what the outcome would be. He felt a strange, unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a sensation that was equal parts apprehension and a nascent, fiercely protective instinct. When they arrived at the penthouse, the contrast was jarring. Ilara stood on the immaculate Italian marble of the foyer, a small dripping figure in a cavernous space of minimalist design and priceless art. Her wet shoes left faint tracks on the polished floor, the first and only imperfection the space had likely ever known. Mrs. Gable, his stern but efficient housekeeper, emerged from the residence's private wing, her face a mask of polite shock. "Sir," she inquired, her eyes darting from Kalen to the child and back again. "There has been a change of plans," Kalen stated, his tone leaving no room for questions. "Please see to our guest. A warm bath, clothes, food, whatever she needs." Mrs. Gable, a woman who had handled visiting dignitaries and temperamental billionaires without batting an eye, simply nodded and gently led the silent Ilara away. Later that night, Kalen stood by his floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. The storm had begun to subside and the city below was sharp and clear again, a predictable pattern of light and order. But his own world was no longer so. From the corner of his eye, he could see Ilara now dressed in an oversized pajama shirt provided by Mrs. Gable. She was curled up on a vast white sofa, not sleeping but watching him with those same unsettlingly calm and intelligent eyes. He had made a decision based on something other than logic. He had introduced a random variable into his controlled experiment. He didn't know if he had just saved a life or made the biggest mistake of his career. He only knew that nothing would be the same. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with unspoken questions and the beginning of an unfathomable new equation. He had built an empire by predicting the future, by seeing patterns others missed. Yet as he looked at the small child who now occupied the heart of his fortress, he realized he could not predict what would happen tomorrow. The thought should have terrified him. He had always equated the unknown with risk and risk with failure. But as he met Ilara's steady gaze, the feeling was not fear. It was a profound and unnerving sense of curiosity. Who was this child, and what was the nature of the storm that had brought her to his door? He had an unsettling feeling that the downpour outside was nothing compared to the tempest she was about to unleash in his perfectly curated life. For the first time, he was operating without a safety net, guided by a single, illogical act of compassion. The penthouse was quiet, but for the low hum of the building's climate control systems. Kalen had dismissed his staff for the night, an unusual move that underscored the abnormality of the situation. He needed to think to process the events that had so thoroughly derailed his routine. He walked over to the sofa, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. Ilara tracked his movements but didn't stir. He sat on a facing armchair, creating a space between them that felt both vast and intimate. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She shook her head. "Are you tired?" Another shake. He was a master of negotiation, skilled in extracting information and leveraging it for profit. Yet he could elicit nothing from this child but the barest of gestures. It was both frustrating and oddly fascinating. He decided to try a different approach, the one he knew best. He picked up his tablet and projected a holographic display of the global markets into the air between them. It was a shimmering, three-dimensional cloud of numbers, charts, and flowing lines of light, a language he was more fluent in than any spoken tongue. He expected her to be scared or confused by the complex display. Instead, Ilara's eyes, which had been so placid, now lit with a spark of genuine interest. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze sweeping across the torrent of data with an intensity that startled him. She was processing information at a speed that even his most brilliant analysts would struggle to match. He watched her, a dawning sense of awe beginning to replace his confusion. This child was more than just a victim of circumstance. She was something else entirely, and she was now his responsibility. The weight of that thought settled upon him heavier than any corporate merger or hostile takeover. It was a new kind of pressure, one he was not yet sure he was equipped to handle. But as he saw the flicker of genius in her eyes, he knew he had to try. The morning brought a fragile, temporary truce. The storm had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean and glistening under a pale Sunday. In Kalen's penthouse, an awkward domesticity was attempting to take root. Mrs. Gable had, with quiet efficiency, produced a selection of new clothes for Ilara, and the child now sat at the enormous marble kitchen island, solemnly eating a bowl of cereal. Kalen watched her from the entrance of his home office, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He had barely slept. His mind, usually a seamless engine of logic and strategy, was consumed by the anomaly that was Alara. He felt like a mathematician who had discovered an impossible number one that defied all known laws yet demonstrably existed. He had run a preliminary background check overnight, but it yielded almost nothing. No school records, no medical history, no digital footprint. It was as if she and her parents had lived completely off the grid. He retreated into the familiar sanctuary of his office, a room that was the true heart of his empire. Banks of monitors covered one wall while a central holographic projector stood ready to bring data to life. This was his battlefield, and he was its undisputed king. He sat in his command chair and initiated his morning ritual, absorbing the overnight market shifts from Asia and Europe. But his focus was fractured. The image of Alara's small hand and of her silent, watchful eyes kept intruding upon the streams of data. It was an unwelcome, inefficient distraction. He was preparing to dive into a particularly volatile trade involving a biotech firm, a high-risk, high-reward venture that his AI analytics had flagged as a prime opportunity. He needed his full, undivided attention. The trade began smoothly. He invested a substantial 8-figure sum, and for the first hour, the stock climbed exactly as the models had predicted. A video conference link shimmered into existence on one of his screens, showing the faces of his lead trading team, their expressions confident. "Everything is proceeding as projected, Mr. Vance," said his chief strategist, a man named Marcus Chen. "We're on track for a 17% return by midday." Kalen gave a curt nod, his gaze fixed on the upward trajectory of the green line. A collective gasp came from his team. Red alerts began flashing across the screens, the calm of the morning shattered by a symphony of digital alarms. The atmosphere in the virtual boardroom became frantic. There was a news blast. A rumor about their lead drug trial failing. It's unconfirmed, but the market is spooked. The algorithm didn't see this. The stock was now in freefall. Panic selling had created a cascade effect, and Kalen was watching millions of dollars of his capital evaporate with every passing second. Sell now. Another trader urged, his voice tight with panic. "We need to cut our losses before we're wiped out." The advice was sound logical. It was the standard procedure. Every instinct Kalen had honed over a decade of ruthless trading screamed at him to pull the plug, salvage what he could from the wreckage. He was poised to give the order, his fingers hovering over the command interface. It was then that a small presence entered his peripheral vision. Alara had wandered into the office, drawn by the flashing lights and urgent noises. She stood beside his chair, looking not at him, but at the massive holographic display that now showed the stock's catastrophic descent. To the panicked traders on the screen, her appearance was a bizarre, inexplicable intrusion, but Kalen was frozen by the look on her face. It was the same intense, focused curiosity he had seen the night before. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she were listening to a piece of complex music. She ignored the plunging red line that represented millions in losses and focused instead on the raw data stream. Codes. She lifted a small hand and pointed a finger at the holographic cloud of numbers. Her finger traced a pattern that was invisible to everyone else, a faint, rhythmic pulse hidden within the chaotic noise of the sell-off. It was a subtle, repeating flicker in the transaction sequence, a digital heartbeat that was almost perfectly masked by the larger market panic. "Echo," she whispered, the words so quiet it was almost lost in the clamor of the alarms. Kalen stared at the point she indicated. He could barely see it even now. It was a ghost, a whisper in the machine, but he had seen her read this language before. An insane, illogical, and utterly unprofessional hunch took root in his mind. It went against his training, his experience, and every analytical model he had ever trusted. "Buy," Kalen said, his voice cutting through the panic of his team. They were now down $9 million. "I said buy," Kalen repeated, his eyes locked on the spot Alara had identified. "Execute a block purchase. All available reserve capital. Now." The faces of his team registered sheer disbelief. This was not trading. It was financial suicide. It was pouring gasoline on a raging fire. Arthur, standing sentinel by the door, took a half-step forward, his expression etched with concern for his employer's sanity. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the stock continued to plummet. The red numbers on his loss column spun higher. The silence was deafening. Kalen felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He had bet his reputation, his fortune, on the whisper of a 6-year-old child. And then the miracle happened. The echo Alara had spotted was not random noise. It was the carefully concealed footprint of a massive institutional player, initiating a hostile takeover using the bad news as a smokescreen to accumulate shares at a rock-bottom price. The wave of panic selling was exactly the cover they needed. Kalen's colossal buy order, executed just moments before the takeover was officially announced, hit the market at the perfect instant. The stock didn't just bottom out, it reversed course with the explosive force of a rocket launch. The red line on the screen turned 90 degrees and shot vertically upward. The screens bled from red to a brilliant, beautiful green. The takeover announcement flashed across the news feeds, and the stock value more than doubled in the span of seconds. The traders on the video link were utterly speechless, their mouths agape as they watched the profit counter spin, wildly erasing the massive loss and climbing into positive territory. It finally settled at a net profit of just over $5 million. He simply terminated the connection, plunging the office back into silence. The alarms were gone. The flashing red lights were gone. All that remained was the quiet hum of the machines and the shimmering green of the final tally. He felt a wave of adrenaline-fueled dizziness. He had walked to the edge of the abyss and against all odds had flown over it. He slowly turned his chair to face Alara. She was no longer looking at the data cloud. The intense focus was gone, replaced by the simple curiosity of a child. She was now examining the intricate weave of the rug, her mission apparently complete. He knelt in front of her, his heart still pounding in his chest. He knew asking her to explain what she saw would be pointless. She likely didn't have the words for it. She didn't see stocks or algorithms. She saw the underlying rhythm, the hidden poetry of the numbers. "The pattern," he said, his voice soft. "You saw the pattern." Alara looked up at him and gave a small, simple nod before taking a delicate sip of the apple juice Mrs. Gable had given her. In that moment, Kalen Vance understood. He hadn't just brought a lost child into his home. He had unknowingly taken in a prodigy, a savant, whose mind perceived the world on a level he could barely begin to imagine. The $5 million profit was meaningless. The true discovery was the small girl standing before him. She was a key, but to what lock he did not yet know. The $5 million profit was a ghost in the machine, a spectacular but ultimately meaningless byproduct of the day's true revelation. As the adrenaline of the near-catastrophic trade subsided, Kalen Vance was left with a chilling and profound clarity. The child Alara was not just a prodigy. Her unique perception of patterns was a key, and where there is a key, there is a lock. And whatever that lock protected, it was valuable enough that someone had tried to make her disappear. The thought transformed his nascent protective instinct into a cold, hard sense of duty. Her safety was now his primary operational directive, a variable more important than any stock market fluctuation. He was no longer just a guardian, he was a fortress. That afternoon he made a call. Not to his traders or his lawyers, but to a man who existed only in the deepest shadows of the corporate world. Julian Croft was a legend, a digital phantom whose expertise lay in acquiring information that did not want to be found. He operated with a team of specialists who could bypass the most sophisticated security systems on Earth, both digital and human. Julian Kalen said, his voice low and devoid of pleasantries. "I have a task for you. Priority Alpha. I'm sending you a file." The file contained only a name, Alara, and a grainy photo from a gas station security camera of a couple taken 2 months prior. Her parents. Find out who they were, what they did, and what happened to them. The official story will be a lie. Julian's reply was, as always, concise. "Understood." The line went dead. Kalen knew that with that single word, a silent, invisible army of investigators had just been mobilized. He then turned his own formidable research abilities toward the public face of the problem. A quick search of the academic and corporate databases for researchers matching the parents' description who had recently died flagged a single hit: Dr. Eris and Dr. Lena Petrova. Their employer was listed as Ethelred Corporation. Kalen felt a familiar, unpleasant tightening in his gut. Ethelred was his most significant rival, a corporate behemoth run by a man who mirrored Kalen's own ambition and intellect but lacked any of his moral restraint. Marcus Thorne, the CEO of Ethelred, was a master of public perception. To the world, he was a visionary, a charismatic innovator, pushing the boundaries of technology for the betterment of mankind. Kalen, however, saw the shark beneath the polished surface. He knew Thorne's history of brutal, hostile takeovers, of intellectual property theft, disguised as collaboration of careers and lives, ruined in the relentless pursuit of market dominance. Thorne was a predator who viewed the world as his personal hunting ground. The fact that Alara's parents had worked for him was not a coincidence. It was a declaration of intent. Kalen began to construct a threat assessment profile on his office's smart glass, linking Thorne to the Petrovas, a web of connections beginning to form. The first report from Julian arrived less than 12 hours later, encrypted and delivered through a secure channel. It confirmed Kalen's suspicions and painted a grim picture. The Petrovas were not just data scientists, they were pioneers in the field of quantum cognitive modeling. In layman's terms, they were trying to teach a machine to think not like a computer, but to have intuition to see patterns in chaos like a human genius. They were working on a top-secret initiative at Ethelred, a project so classified that even Julian's best agents could only find its codename Chimera. The official cause of their death was a tragic car accident on a remote stretch of mountain highway. Their vehicle, a late-model sedan, known for its safety features, had supposedly suffered catastrophic brake failure during a storm and plunged into a ravine. Julian, however, had dug deeper. He had acquired the unedited dashcam footage from the first state trooper on the scene. For a few crucial seconds before the trooper exited his vehicle, the camera had recorded a second set of tire tracks in the mud beside the spot where the Petrovas' car went off the road. Heavy-duty tracks belonging to a truck or a heavy SUV that were not mentioned anywhere in the official accident report. Furthermore, the lead investigator who closed the case with remarkable speed had a month later purchased a multi-million-dollar beachfront property paid for in cash through a shell corporation that Julian was already beginning to dismantle. The accident was a professionally executed assassination. The final chilling piece of the puzzle came from a different source. Another of Julian's teams had been scouring weeks of CCTV footage from transportation hubs across 3 states. They found her. A week after the reported accident, Ilara was seen on a grainy video at a bus terminal 300 miles away. She was being led by the hand by an unidentified woman, with her face obscured by a hat and sunglasses. The woman purchased a ticket to a random destination for the child, gave her a small backpack, and then walked away, melting back into the crowd. It was a cold, calculated disposal. They simply discarded her, assuming a 6-year-old would be swallowed up by the system or perish on the streets. They had underestimated the child, and they had no idea who would find her. Kalen stood before the holographic display in his office, the pieces of the investigation floating around him like malevolent stars in a dark galaxy. The faces of Eris and Lena Petrova smiling in a family photo. The redacted files of Project Chimera. The falsified accident report. The ghostly image of Ilara being abandoned. It was a clear, undeniable narrative of greed, murder, and conspiracy. The Petrovas had created something for Marcus Thorne, something powerful. And when they became a liability, he had eliminated them and thrown their daughter away like so much trash. A cold, precise rage and emotion Kalen had not felt in years began to solidify within him. This was no longer just about protecting Ilara. This was about retribution. He looked over at the living area. Ilara was sitting on the floor with a tablet he had given her. He had expected her to play games or watch cartoons, but she had instead opened a complex geometric modeling application. On the screen, she was not drawing pictures, but building intricate, interlocking, fractal patterns with a speed and intuitive grace that was breathtaking. He realized with a jolt that he was looking at her legacy. This was how her parents had taught her, how they had honed her incredible mind. They had played games of pattern and sequence, unknowingly arming their daughter with the very language of their secret work. Marcus Thorne thought he had buried his secret when he murdered the Petrovas. He was wrong. The secret was alive, and it was currently building a perfect digital replica of a Sierpinski carpet in the middle of Kalen Vance's living room. The hunt was on, but the roles had been reversed. Thorne thought he was the predator, but he was now the prey. In the Ethelred Corporation's headquarters, a tower of black glass that seemed to absorb the sunlight, Marcus Thorne's office was a testament to conquest. Where Kalen Vance's penthouse was a study in minimalist precision, Thorne's was a shrine to opulent power. A vast mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine dominated the room. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling aquarium where exotic predatory fish swam in silent, endless circles. It was here, surrounded by the spoils of his corporate wars, that Thorne received the first piece of news that would unravel his carefully constructed world. His head of security, a man named Sterling, stood before the desk. Sterling was a man carved from granite, his expression perpetually neutral. his presence exuding a quiet lethality. He was the instrument of Thorne's will, the hand that moved in the shadows to ensure his master's dominance. We have a development regarding Kalen. Vance. Sterling began, his voice, a low monotone. He appears to have acquired a new liability. He has taken in a child, a 6-year-old girl he reportedly found on the street during the storm 2 nights ago. Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. A stray, how wonderfully sentimental of him. Perhaps our cold, calculating rival is developing a heart. This is excellent news, Sterling. A heart is a weakness, a liability that can be leveraged. He pictured Vance, the man whose ruthless efficiency in the market was legendary, being brought low by something as pathetically sentimental as a child. The irony was delicious. Sterling remained impassive, waiting for his employer's amusement to subside. There is another matter, he continued. Yesterday morning, Vance was caught in the Biogen tech collapse. His position was leveraged. He stood to lose over $10 million. Thorne's smile widened. He had heard whispers of the disaster. And was he ruined? He asked, savoring the thought. No, Sterling replied. At the last possible second, he quadrupled his position, buying into the panic. Moments later, a takeover was announced. He didn't just avert the loss. He netted a $5 million profit. The market is calling it the luckiest trade of the decade. The smile vanished from Thorne's face, replaced by a look of sharp analytical intensity. He swiveled his chair to a secondary console and replayed the entire Biogen tech trade, watching the data flow on a holographic display. He saw the catastrophic plunge, and then the moment that defied all logic, Vance's insane suicidal buy order. Thorne was not a man who believed in luck. Luck was a concept for amateurs and fools. What he was seeing was not a gamble. It was an act of impossible foresight. It was as if Vance had known the takeover was coming, a piece of information that had been one of the most closely guarded secrets on the street. How Thorne mused more to himself than to Sterling. How could he possibly have known? A cold, unwelcome suspicion began to form in the back of his mind. Female, approximately 6 years old, dark hair, quiet disposition. We have no positive identification on her yet, Sterling reported. Thorne's eyes narrowed. The description was generic, but the timing was not. The Petrovas had a daughter. Sterling had been tasked with making the problem go away, and he had reported that the loose end had been tidied up. The Petrova girl, Thorne said, his voice turning to ice. You assured me she was gone, erased. Sterling's composure finally showed a crack, a flicker of unease in his eyes. My operative confirmed she was left at a transit station hundreds of miles from here. The odds of her surviving, let alone ending up with a man like Vance, were astronomical. Thorne slammed his fist on the desk, causing the fish in the tank to scatter. I do not pay you for astronomical odds, Sterling. I pay you for certainty. The implications were catastrophic. They had not simply disposed of a grieving child. They had lost the living repository of Eris and Lena Petrova's research. The intuitive pattern recognition games the scientists had played with their daughter were not just parental affection. They were a method of imprinting their life's work onto the only vessel they trusted. And that vessel was now in the hands of his greatest rival. Find her, Thorne hissed. I want to know everything. I want cameras on that building. I want to know what she eats for breakfast. Now. Sterling immediately went to work deploying his network of corporate spies. A hacker team from a secure location in Eastern Europe attempted a low-level intrusion into the residential network, looking for access to camera feeds or audio recorders. An operative disguised as a florist delivering a ridiculously opulent bouquet tried to gain access to the penthouse service elevator, a microcamera hidden in a lapel pin. Another agent attempted to compromise a member of the domestic staff, offering a small fortune for any information about Vance's new guest. Each attempt was a soft tap on the fortress walls, searching for a crack. But the fortress held. Kalen had anticipated Thorne's playbook. Julian's cybersecurity team had erected a digital shield around the penthouse that was virtually impenetrable. The hacking attempt was instantly flagged, isolated in a digital sandbox, and fed a continuous loop of harmless, fabricated data that would keep Thorne's team occupied for weeks. On the physical front, Arthur's security detail was operating at maximum efficiency. The florist was scanned, his biometrics identified him as a former intelligence agent, now working as a corporate spy, and he was politely turned away. The compromised housekeeper who had accepted the bribe was quietly dismissed and replaced before she could pass on a single piece of information. Kalen and his team were not just defending, they were playing a different game entirely. The final move was a masterful piece of psychological warfare. The listening device the housekeeper was supposed to plant was found and discreetly repackaged. 2 days later, a beautifully wrapped gift basket arrived at the office of one of Marcus Thorne's senior vice presidents, a man Kalen knew was Thorne's protege. Inside, nestled amongst the expensive chocolates and fine wine, was the tiny, sophisticated listening device, deactivated and tagged with a small, elegant card. The card contained a single printed word, echo. The message was clear, unambiguous, and terrifying. It was a move on the grand chessboard, a quiet declaration from Kalen Vance that he not only had the piece Thorne had lost, but he also knew the name of the game they were playing. In his office, Sterling delivered the report of their complete and utter failure. Every probe had been detected and neutralized. Worse, their attempts had been turned back on them in a display of humiliating efficiency. Marcus Thorne listened in silence, his face a mask of cold fury. He stared out at the city at the rival Vance Tower, gleaming in the afternoon Sunday. The game of shadows was over. Vance knew. He knew about the girl, he knew about Project Chimera, and he was openly challenging him. Thorne had made the single greatest mistake of his career. He had underestimated his opponent, and in doing so had given him the most valuable weapon imaginable. The Cold War had just turned hot. The single word echo, delivered with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel, had transformed the chessboard. Kalen Vance knew that Marcus Thorne was not a man who would accept such a blatant challenge lying down. The subtle probes would now give way to overt aggression. In response, Kalen's penthouse, already a bastion of modern security, was hardened into a veritable fortress. Arthur managed the physical reinforcement. The panoramic windows, already bullet-resistant, were treated with a polymer film that could withstand an explosive blast. A new network of biometric sensors was seamlessly integrated into the decor, their invisible eyes calibrated to detect the slightest deviation from the norm. Down in the building's security hub, a dedicated team handpicked by Arthur from his days in special operations now monitored the penthouse feeds 24 hours a day. Life within these reinforced walls took on a surreal rhythm. Kalen, to the astonishment of his board of directors, began running his multi-billion-dollar empire almost exclusively from his home office. This decision, born of the necessity to remain close to Alara, forced two completely disparate worlds into collision. He would conduct a ruthless negotiation with a German conglomerate, his voice cutting and precise, then turn to find Alara patiently waiting to show him a complex pattern she had created on her tablet. He would analyze market futures that could shift the economies of entire nations, then pause to answer a softly spoken question about why the sky was blue. The rigid compartments of his life were dissolving the cold logic of his work, now constantly brushing up against the simple, undeniable needs of a child. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fortress Kalen had built around his own heart began to show cracks. He found himself engaging in activities that his former self would have deemed a catastrophic waste of time. One evening, finding Alara staring blankly at a children's book, he sat down and began to read to her. His first attempt, a dry, monotonous recitation of the text, was a failure. On the advice of a privately amused Mrs. Gable, he tried again, this time attempting different voices for the characters. The small, hesitant smile that graced Alara's lips at his clumsy effort felt more valuable than any corporate victory. He began to see her not as a living key or a strategic asset to be protected, but simply as Alara, a small girl who had lost everything and who, against all odds, had ended up in his care. An unfamiliar emotion, warm and fiercely protective, began to take root in the barren soil of his soul. As Alara's sense of safety grew, the profound silence that had enveloped her began to recede. It was a gradual process, like the melting of a glacier. First came single-word answers, then short, hesitant sentences. She began to ask questions, her curiosity about his world blossoming. "Are the numbers angry?" she asked one day, pointing to a plunging stock chart displayed in red. Kalen, for the first time, tried to explain the concept of a financial market to a 6-year-old. He spoke of it as a big game of confidence, where red meant people were scared and green meant they were happy. She seemed to understand this intuitive explanation far better than any technical jargon. She was absorbing his world and, in turn, infusing it with a simple clarity that he had long forgotten. With her growing trust, fragments of her past began to surface. She spoke of her mother singing her a counting song to help her sleep, a song that was made of strange, long words instead of numbers. She remembered her father's office, filled with maps of falling stars, and how he would let her color them in. Kaylin recorded every detail, feeding the information to Julian. A counting song made of long words was likely a mnemonic for a passphrase. Maps of falling stars was almost certainly a child's description of data visualization charts. The innocent games of a loving family were in fact the keys to a kingdom of deadly secrets. The true turning point in their relationship came one night long after the city outside had gone to sleep. A small, choked cry from Alara's room woke Kalen from his light slumber. He found her sitting bolt upright in bed, her small frame trembling, her eyes wide with the remnants of a nightmare. His instinct was to call Mrs. Gable, to delegate the emotional task to someone better equipped. But he hesitated, then walked to her bedside. Awkwardly, he sat down. It was just a dream, he said the words, feeling clumsy and inadequate. She shook her head, whispering about dark monsters with tangled shapes. He didn't know how to fight imaginary monsters, so he chose a weapon he understood: order. There are no monsters here, he said, his voice gaining a quiet confidence. I can prove it. He led her into his office and activated the central holographic projector. But instead of market data, he brought up a detailed, breathtakingly beautiful star chart of the known galaxy. Look, he said softly, pointing to the shimmering constellations. No monsters, just stars and planets. Everything has a place, everything follows a path. It's all just a grand, beautiful pattern. He showed her Orion the Hunter and the graceful arc of the Milky Way. He explained the pull of gravity and the life cycle of a star with the same clarity he would use to describe a corporate structure. Alara's fear subsided, replaced by a look of silent awe. She watched the celestial dance until her eyelids grew heavy, and she fell asleep on the sofa, bathed in the soft light of distant galaxies. It was the first decision he had made entirely with his heart. While this fragile peace blossomed within the fortress, the enemy was regrouping. In his own sterile tower, Marcus Thorne reviewed Sterling's reports. A direct assault on Vance's penthouse was impossible. It was a veritable fortress. Thorne's eyes gleamed with cold fury. If we cannot breach his fortress, he said to Sterling, his voice a low growl, then we will force him to come out. A king is only as strong as his kingdom. We will not attack his home. We will attack his empire. The siege was about to enter a new, more dangerous phase. Thorne would not try to break down the walls. He would burn the world around them until the king had no choice but to surrender. The battle for Alara's future was now being fought on two fronts. In the daylight world, Kalen parried the initial aggressive business maneuvers from Marcus Thorne, a hostile bid for one of Vance Industries' key suppliers, a sudden regulatory challenge from a seemingly unrelated agency, a smear campaign in the financial press. Each move was calculated to distract and bleed him. But Kalen's true focus lay in the war, being waged in the shadows, a silent, clandestine assault conducted from the command center within his penthouse. Here late at night, surrounded by the soft glow of monitors, he and a small elite team worked to unravel the secret that the Petrovas had died to protect. At the head of this digital vanguard was Anya Sharma, the prodigy who led Julian Croft's cybersecurity division, a woman who could navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the digital world like no other. Their starting point was the fragmented memories of a child. They were not just drawings. They were astonishingly accurate schematic representations of a deep learning neural network's architecture. Alara's parents had cleverly disguised their work as an artistic game, embedding the very blueprint of their creation into their daughter's memory. With this unintentional map, Anya's team no longer had to search for a needle in a digital haystack. They now knew the shape of the needle and where in the haystack it was likely hidden. The hunt for the ghost in Ethelred's code began in earnest. Anya's assault was not a frontal attack. It was a masterpiece of stealth and subtlety, more akin to digital archaeology than hacking. Her team moved through Ethelred's servers like phantoms, bypassing the outer layers of security with elegant ease. They sifted through petabytes of data, searching for the digital fingerprints of the Petrovas, a stray line of code, a hidden data repository. The tension in the command center was palpable. Every action carried the risk of detection. They encountered Thorne's digital sentries, aggressive counter-intrusion programs, and sidestepped them, leaving no trace of their passage. After 3 days of relentless around-the-clock work, they found it. It was a fortress within a fortress, a sector of the Ethelred mainframe that was completely isolated, walled off by quantum encryption that made standard security look like a child's lock. It did not have a standard file designation. It was marked only by a single stylized icon, a chimera, the mythical beast of many parts. They had found the lair. Anya's face, illuminated by the screen, was grim. The architecture matches Alara's drawings, she reported to Kalen. But the encryption is something else entirely. It's a dynamic quantum lock. Trying to break it with brute force would be like trying to guess a new word that changes every nanosecond. We can't get in without a key. The word key triggered a memory for Kalen. He thought of Alara's other fragmented memory, the counting song her mother used to sing her to sleep. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all they had. He found Alara in the living area, building a small tower of blocks. He approached the subject carefully, not wanting to frighten her or make her feel pressured. He didn't ask about passwords or secrets. He asked about her mother. "You mentioned she used to sing you a special song," he said softly, sitting on the floor beside her. "Do you remember any of it?" Alara paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. She hummed a few bars of a strange, disjointed melody. "It had funny words," she said quietly. She recalled a few of the funny words. They were a jumble of seemingly nonsensical syllables. Kalen recorded them and sent the audio file to Anya. To him, it was gibberish. To Anya, it was the Rosetta Stone. "These aren't random," she said, her voice electric with excitement. "They're phonetic fragments of algorithmic seeds. They built a key generation algorithm and tied it to a lullaby. The song isn't the key. It's the recipe for the key." The fragments Alara provided were not enough to open the door, but they were enough for Anya to understand the lock's design. Her team worked furiously, using the phonetic seeds to reverse engineer the underlying cryptographic logic. Hours later, a triumphant message flashed on Kalen's screen. "We're in." What they found inside Project Chimera was more terrifying than Kalen had ever imagined. It was not merely a predictive AI for market analysis. It was a weapon of mass economic disruption. Chimera could autonomously create and disseminate false information, executing thousands of microtrades per second to simulate market panic or euphoria. It could destabilize entire economic sectors, ruin corporations, and even trigger national currency crises, all while perfectly masking its own intervention. It was the ultimate insider trading tool capable of generating billions for Thorn by creating the very events it predicted. Buried deep within the code, they also found logs left by the Petrovas. The entries chronicled their growing horror as they realized their creation, intended to identify and prevent market volatility, was being twisted into a predatory weapon. Their final log entry was a desperate declaration of defiance. They knew Thorn would never let them leave, and they couldn't destroy the project without being detected. They built a failsafe, a logic bomb hidden in Chimera's core programming. Alara's Ghost. It was a self-destruct sequence that, when activated, would not only purge Chimera's code, but would also broadcast the AI's entire operational history, including every illegal command issued by Thorn to every major financial perception, regulatory body, and news organization on the planet. It was an act of mutually assured destruction. The Ghost was their justice, their revenge. But activating it required one final component. The failsafe was protected by a single, unbreakable password. To activate it, they needed the entire lullaby sung in perfect sequence. Kalen and Anya stared at the screen, the weight of their discovery settling upon them. But the final code was locked in the mind of a 6-year-old girl who had already been through an unimaginable trauma. The stakes had been raised to an impossible level. It was no longer about justice for one family. It was about preventing Thorn from gaining the power to hold the entire global economy hostage. And as Kalen looked at the reports of Thorn's escalating attacks on his businesses, he knew their time was running out. They had to find a way to unlock Alara's final memory before Thorn's siege brought their own world crashing down around them. The digital ghost that Kalen's team had been hunting was now cornered, and Marcus Thorn could feel it. His own cybersecurity division, among the best in the world, reported faint, untraceable ripples within the Chimera project's data core. They couldn't pinpoint the source, but they knew someone was inside the sanctuary. For Thorn, a man obsessed with control, the knowledge that his ultimate weapon had been compromised was intolerable. His patient strategy of applying external pressure to Kalen's empire was now obsolete. In the cold, sterile light of his office, he gave Sterling 2 simple, brutal commands. The first was to launch Operation Hydra, a full-spectrum cybernetic assault designed not to steal information, but to annihilate the entire digital infrastructure of Vance Industries. The second was to deploy an elite mercenary team to breach Vance Tower and retrieve the asset Alara by any means necessary. In Kalen's penthouse, the quiet intensity of the command center was shattered. Every screen suddenly blared red as a cascade of alarms shrieked through the room. Anya Sharma's face was a mask of grim focus. "It's a blitzkrieg," she announced, her fingers flying across her console. "They're not trying to be subtle. This is a decapitation strike." Kalen watched the holographic display, which now showed a swarm of hostile code engulfing his corporate network like a plague of locusts. He saw his life's work, the meticulously built empire of data and finance, threatening to crumble into digital dust. But his face remained a mask of unshakable calm. He had anticipated this scorched earth tactic. Just as he began issuing countermeasures to Anya, a new, more urgent alert chimed. A four-man team bypassed the elevator security using a high-frequency jammer. They're ascending via the west stairwell. The two-pronged attack was perfectly synchronized. Thorne intended to paralyze his mind with the digital assault while striking at his heart with the physical one. It was a classic pincer movement designed to overwhelm and crush him. But Kalen Vance was not a man who was easily overwhelmed. For the first time, he felt the cold fury of a king whose castle was under direct assault, and he would not let it fall. A profound and dangerous clarity settled over him. He trusted his people. He turned to Anya, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "The network is yours, Anya. Lock down our core assets, sever all external connections if you have to. Hold the line. I don't care about the cost." Kalen then switched his focus entirely to the physical threat, his comms now linked directly to Arthur and his security team. On a secondary display, he brought up the schematics of the tower, tracking the intruder's progress as red dots moving swiftly upward. He was no longer a CEO. He was a commander, and this was his fortress. "Arthur," he commanded, "funnel them to the 98th floor. I want them contained in the service corridor. Non-lethal takedowns only." The battle raged on two fronts. In the digital realm, Anya and her team were engaged in a desperate fight. The Hydra code was a monster, constantly mutating and finding new vulnerabilities. For every breach they patched, two more would appear. But Anya's team was not just defending, they were learning. They were analyzing the attack structure, finding its central nervous system, preparing for a counterstrike. It was a brutal high-speed war of attrition, fought with logic and electricity, a silent battle where the fate of a global corporation hung in the balance. Every second, billions of dollars in assets were at risk, but Anya fought with a cold, focused fury, protecting the kingdom while her king protected the air. Meanwhile, in the concrete and steel corridors of the tower, a different kind of battle was being fought. Arthur and his three-man team, clad in dark tactical gear, moved with the silent efficiency of predators. They intercepted the mercenary team in the narrow service corridor of the 98th floor. The fight was swift, brutal, and almost completely silent. The mercenaries were highly skilled, but Arthur's team had the home field advantage and a superior strategy. Using a combination of tactical surprise and advanced non-lethal weaponry, they neutralized the attackers one by one. The final confrontation saw Arthur face the mercenary leader, a scarred veteran who was momentarily stunned by the sheer professionalism of the defense. A brief, intense struggle ended with the leader disarmed and subdued. "Tell your boss," Arthur said, calmly securing the man's hands, that he made a mistake. Back in the command center, as Arthur reported that the physical threat was neutralized, Anya found her opening. The Hydra attack, in its arrogance, had a single point of command and control. Anya had traced it back to a series of encrypted servers hidden within Aethelred's own network. "I have them," she said to Kalen. "I'm launching the counter-virus." She typed a final command in a single elegant string of code. Her silver bullet was unleashed. It didn't just block the attack, it infiltrated the Hydra network, reversed its flow, and sent a catastrophic feedback surge straight back to its source. Deep within Aethelred, tower servers sparked and died, their systems fried by their own weapon. The digital swarm vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The attack was over. Silence returned to the penthouse. Kalen stood amidst the digital wreckage, his empire bruised but intact. The captured mercenaries were being taken to a secure off-site location for interrogation. He walked out of the office and into the living area where Mrs. Gable was comforting a frightened but unharmed Alara. He knelt before her, his expression softening as he saw that she was safe. In that moment, he understood that the fight for his company had been secondary. His primary directive had been to protect her. This realization solidified his resolve into something as hard and unbreakable as diamond. He knew Thorne, in his arrogance, would be monitoring any available feeds. Kalen walked to a corner of the room, looked directly into the lens of one of his own security cameras, and spoke, his voice cold and clear, a promise and a threat. "Now I'm coming for your kingdom." The immediate aftermath of the assault was a strange, suspended silence. The alarms were off, the digital fires were being extinguished by Anya's team, and Arthur had confirmed the complete neutralization of the physical threat. Yet the sterile air of the penthouse was thick with the residue of violence. The war had breached their sanctuary, and though the walls had held the illusion of perfect safety, had been shattered. Kalen's first priority was not the damage report from his company or the interrogation of the captured mercenaries. It was Alara. He found her curled on a sofa, wrapped in a blanket by Mrs. Gable, her wide eyes staring at nothing. She wasn't crying, but a deep, resonant fear had replaced her usual quiet curiosity. The monsters she had dreamt of had for a few terrifying moments become real. Kalen made a decision that a month ago would have been unthinkable. He instructed his senior executive team to handle the immediate corporate crisis, canceled his calls with global financiers, and disconnected from his command center. His entire world for that moment shrank to the space around the small, trembling girl on his sofa. He sat beside her, not speaking, simply offering his steady presence as an anchor in the storm of her fear. He understood that what she needed was not a brilliant strategist or a powerful CEO, but a guardian. A father. Mrs. Gable brought them both mugs of hot chocolate, and the three of them sat in a small pocket of defiant domesticity, a silent testament to the fact that their home, though attacked, was not broken. He wanted to soothe her, but he was a man unversed in the language of comfort. He had no gentle words, no practiced reassurances. In a clumsy, instinctive attempt to distract her, he began to hum a low, tuneless sound that was meant to be calming, but was merely awkward. The discordant sound seemed to have snagged on a thread in her memory. "That's not right," she whispered, her voice fragile. "It's not the right song." Kalen stopped, embarrassed. "I'm not much of a singer," he admitted. "My mother—" "She sang a better one," Alara said, her gaze turning inward, chasing a distant echo. "She sang it when I was scared, the counting song, and then in the quiet of the embattled penthouse, a miracle unfolded." Alara began to hum. It was the same disjointed melody she had recalled before, but now it was clearer, more confident. As the tune flowed, the funny words returned to her, not in fragments, but as a whole, complete sequence. She began to recite them in a soft, clear voice, the complex string of characters flowing with the simple, innocent rhythm of a nursery rhyme. It was a long, intricate phrase, a seemingly random mix of letters, numbers, and symbols that she spoke with perfect, unwavering recall. "Alpha Eris, 7 Pi Lambda," she began the lullaby of a quantum physicist. "She said it was the key," Alara whispered, as she finished the key to the secret garden to make the monster go to sleep. Kalen sat frozen, his blood turning to ice in his veins. He recognized the sequence not as a song, but as the elegant, unbreakable structure of a master encryption key. It was a password that could only be remembered by a mind like Alara's, a mind that saw not random characters, but a beautiful, logical pattern. A password that could be taught and reinforced through the gentle, loving act of a mother singing her child to sleep. He pulled out his personal tablet and gently asked, "Can you show me?" Alara nodded, and with her small finger traced the entire sequence onto the screen. It was flawless. This was it, the final missing piece. The activation key for the ghost in the machine. With a speed that belied his calm exterior, he encrypted the sequence and sent it to Anya with a single-word command: "Verify." He then turned his attention back to Alara, his expression soft, betraying none of the cataclysmic significance of what she had just done. To her, she had simply shared a memory of her mother. To him, she had just handed him the weapon that could bring down an empire. A moment later, his tablet chimed. A screenshot of their Chimera simulation interface. Kalen's transmitted sequence was entered into the final command prompt. Beneath it, a single line of text glowed in green, key authenticated. "Awaiting execution protocol." A wave of cold, triumphant electricity shot through him. The gun was loaded. The safety was off. The strategic landscape had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer on the defensive. He now held the ultimate offensive weapon. He reconvened his war council. Julian reported that the captured mercenaries, under intense interrogation, had confirmed their orders came directly from Sterling, providing a clear, prosecutable link to Marcus Thorne. Arthur confirmed that the penthouse's defenses could be held indefinitely against any similar assault. Anya confirmed she had full undetected access to Chimera's kill switch. All the pieces were in place. The time for parrying and defense was over. It was time to attack. In the command center, Kalen outlined his final gambit. It would be a mirror of Thorne's own strategy, a two-pronged assault, but executed with a devastating finality. Anya, he commanded, prepare to execute the moment I give the word. Julian, I want you to leak the information from the interrogations to your most trusted contacts at the SEC and the Justice Department time to the second. Arthur maintained the fortress. Thorne will be a cornered animal, and he will be dangerous. The final piece of his plan was his own. It was a move of corporate genius, an act of audacious aggression that would serve as the perfect distraction. He would not just destroy Thorne's secret weapon, he would take his entire kingdom in the process. He looked at the screen at the waiting execution command, then through the glass wall to where Alara was finally peacefully asleep on the sofa. She had given him the key. Now he would turn it. The dawn of the final day broke not with the sound of gunfire, but with the ringing of 1,000 phones. The financial world awoke to a seismic shockwave. Vance Industries had launched an audacious, full-scale hostile takeover bid for Ethelred Corporation. The move was a masterstroke of misdirection. Kalen Vance, known for his precise strategic investments, was now behaving like a brutish corporate raider. Pundits on financial networks were stunned, calling it a desperate, emotionally charged gambit. They had no idea it was merely the opening salvo, the grand distraction in a war that was about to reach its devastating conclusion. In his tower, Marcus Thorne laughed. He saw the move as the last pathetic thrashing of a drowning man. He was so confident, so utterly consumed by his own arrogance, that he failed to see the digital dagger already poised at his back. Thorne immediately mobilized his forces, rallying his board, his lawyers, and his investment bankers to crush the takeover attempt. He called for an emergency global shareholder meeting to be held via secure video conference, a platform where his charisma and manipulative rhetoric could be used to maximum effect. He saw the meeting as a public execution, a stage where he would humiliate his rival and solidify his own power. As he prepared, radiating confidence, he was completely oblivious to the fact that Kalen Vance was not only watching his every move, but was also patiently waiting for the precise moment to strike. The predator was so focused on the bait that he failed to see the jaws of the trap closing around him. The shareholder meeting began exactly as Thorne had planned. He was magnificent, a master puppeteer playing to his audience. He painted Kalen Vance as an unstable aggressor, his takeover bid an act of desperation. He assured his investors of Ethelred's unshakable stability and brilliant future. Mr. Vance's actions are not those of a competitor, Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescending pity, but of a man who has clearly lost his way. He was at the peak of his power, basking in the glow of his own perceived invincibility, when a new window suddenly appeared on the main conference screen. Using the significant block of Ethelred shares he had quietly acquired over the years he had legally joined the meeting, Thorne's face contorted in a brief flash of rage before he smoothed it back into a mask of amusement. Well, well, he sneered. If it isn't the man of the hour, have you come to beg for our forgiveness? Kalen ignored the jibe. His voice was quiet, yet it commanded the attention of every person on the call. I am here, Marcus, because your investors deserve to know the truth about the foundation upon which this company is built. They deserve to know that it is built on lies, theft, and murder. Before Thorne could order the technicians to cut his feed, Kalen began his assault. He wasn't presenting a corporate argument. He was unveiling a criminal indictment. He started with the deaths of Eris and Lena Petrova. With cold, methodical precision, he presented the evidence. Julian had gathered the unaltered accident report, showing a second set of tire tracks, the financial records of the corrupt police chief, the sworn testimony of the captured mercenary, team leader. His voice electronically disguised, but his words damningly clear, confessing that his orders to abduct a 6-year-old child came directly from Ethelred's executive security. A wave of shock and horror washed over the faces of the board members. Thorne, for the first time, was speechless, his charismatic facade beginning to crumble. But Kalen was not finished. But murdering 2 brilliant scientists and orphaning their child was not the end goal, Kalen continued, his voice like ice. It was merely a means to an end. It was to protect your greatest asset, a weapon of economic destruction you codenamed Project Chimera. He looked away from the camera for a fraction of a second, his eyes meeting Anya's across the command center. He gave a single sharp nod. In her own corner of the room, Anya's fingers danced across her keyboard, typing the final command and inputting the lullaby key. She hit enter. For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. Then, chaos erupted in Thorne's boardroom. Alarms, loud and frantic, began to shriek. Technicians were shouting in panic. On the side of the screen, the Ethelred stock ticker, which had been fluctuating wildly, suddenly froze, then began a vertical plunge that defied all logic. At that exact same second, the email inboxes of every person on the call, along with the SEC, the Department of Justice, and the world's leading financial news outlets, chimed with a new message. The subject line was a single word: Chimera. The attachment was a massive data file. It was the Ghost. The complete unredacted operational logs of Thorne's predatory AI, a perfect record of every crime he had ever used it to commit. Marcus Thorne watched his face a canvas of disbelief and horror as his empire turned to ash in real time. The weapon he had killed to protect had become the very evidence that would destroy him. The livestock ticker showed his company's value evaporating into nothing. His phone began to light up with calls he would never be able to answer. He looked at the security feed from his building's lobby and saw the calm, determined faces of federal agents sweeping past his guards. The game was over. The king had been cornered in his own castle, not by an army, but by a lullaby. His arrogance, his hubris had been his undoing. He had underestimated the love of two parents for their child and the resolve of the man who had taken her in. In his penthouse, Kalen Vance calmly terminated his connection to the conference call. The sounds of Ethelred's death throes faded into silence. He didn't look at the screen, showing the financial markets in turmoil, or the news alerts proclaiming the fall of Marcus Thorne. He looked instead at a different monitor, one showing a quiet video feed from Alara's bedroom. She was sleeping soundly, safe and at peace. He had wielded his power, his intellect, and his fortune not for profit but for a singular, clear purpose. Justice had been served. Checkmate. The fall of Ethelred Corporation was as swift as it was spectacular. In the weeks that followed the disastrous shareholder meeting, the full scope of Marcus Thorne's crimes was laid bare for the world to see. The Chimera data released by Kalen's team was an unassailable record of corruption and manipulation. Thorne and his key lieutenants, including Sterling, were arrested in a series of high-profile raids, their confident smirks replaced by the grim, defeated expressions of caged animals. The financial world was in an uproar, but Kalen Vance remained conspicuously silent. He allowed the narrative to form on its own, that of a ruthless corporate raider who had by sheer luck stumbled upon a rot at the heart of his rival. The truth that the key to it all was a 6-year-old girl remained his and his team's most closely guarded secret, a final, impenetrable shield to protect Alara's future. With the battle won, Kalen turned his attention to securing a different kind of justice. He used his newly acquired control over Ethelred's remaining legitimate assets, not to enrich himself, but to create a legacy. He established the Petrova Foundation, a multi-billion-dollar nonprofit organization dedicated to the study and promotion of ethical artificial intelligence. It was a public monument to the genius of Aris and Lena Petrova, ensuring their names would be remembered not for the weapon Thorne had twisted their work into, but for the brilliant creative minds they truly were. It was a final fitting tribute, a way to ensure that their ghost in the machine would ultimately serve the cause of good. The final step in securing that future took place not in a boardroom or a command center, but in the quiet, wood-paneled chambers of a family court judge. Kalen Vance, a man who could command the attention of global markets, sat humbly, his hands clasped as the judge reviewed the thick file before her. She looked from the documents to Kalen, her gaze sharp and discerning. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice even, "you are a man of immense power and responsibility. Your life is a whirlwind of high-stakes deals and global travel. Tell me, why should this court believe you can provide a stable, loving home for this child?" Kalen didn't respond with a list of his resources or the security he could provide. He simply looked at Alara, who was sitting beside him, her hand tucked trustingly in his. "Because," he said, his voice stripped of all its corporate authority, "everything I did for the last few months I did to keep her safe. And because my life is no longer calculated in dollars, Your Honor, it's calculated in moments like these." The judge held his gaze for a long moment, then looked at the small girl who was smiling up at her guardian. A warm, genuine smile spread across her own face. Adoption granted. Life in the penthouse transformed. The command center was still there, a silent testament to the battles they had won, but it was now mostly dormant. One of the stark white minimalist rooms was now a riot of color, a playroom filled with toys, books, and art supplies. Ilara's drawings, once intricate, obsessive patterns, now depicted lopsided houses, a smiling sun, and stick figures of her and Kalen holding hands. They were taped proudly to the door of the stainless steel refrigerator. Kalen's schedule, once a rigid, unforgiving document dictated by the opening bells of stock exchanges from Tokyo to New York, now had new non-negotiable entries. School play trip to the zoo and read bedtime story. One afternoon, as they sat by the window overlooking the city, Kalen told Ilara about the Petrova Foundation. He explained that it was to help people remember how brilliant and good her parents were. He gently asked if someday she might want to learn more about the amazing work they did. He made it clear that there was no pressure, that her only job was to be a child. Ilara listened patiently, then leaned her head against his arm. "That's nice, Dad," she said, the words sounding perfectly natural. "Can we go to the park now? You promised to push me on the swings." Kalen looked at her, a wave of profound love washing over him. The patterns, the numbers, the gift, it would all be there if she ever chose to explore it. But for now, all that mattered was the swing set. The sun was warm, the sky a perfect cloudless blue. In the middle of a sprawling city park, the sound of a child's happy laughter rang out. Kalen Vance, his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, pushed Ilara on a swing, sending her soaring into the air. He was laughing too, a real unburdened sound of pure joy that he hadn't known he was capable of. He watched his daughter, his Ilara, fly towards the sky, her face alight with happiness, and he understood. The greatest trait of his life wasn't the one that made him $5 million in 3 seconds. It was the one he made on a rainy night when he exchanged a life of perfect sterile order for one of unpredictable, chaotic, and immeasurable love. The man who had spent his life calculating every possible outcome had finally found his greatest profit in a future he could never have predicted.